of the same deal, except we're just going to be working with more clay, right? So what I started out by doing was rounding out the bottom of my clay. That way when I smash it down, which I way missed the middle, that way when I smash it down, it forces air out instead of forcing air up and under, right? There we go. We'll start by doing a little bit of smack centering, just to get it nice and secured to the wheel. Add a bunch of lubrication. I'll then go in with my like sort of spider hand feel. Just lean on the clay to get it closer to center. And then we will start to do the coning up, coning down, wheel wedging deal. I squeeze in from opposite corners, rise up. And when I do this, one thing I noticed that some students do is they kind of have the thing going on right now like I do, where there's like, almost like a skirt, and they'll start from like here, because it's easy to move this clay up, it's difficult to move the bottom clay up, right? So really try to focus on squeezing that very bottom clay up and in too, so that you can help get it centered. All right, so we've got our cone, and now we got a smush. So I'm gonna go down and to the right until the clay lines up back under itself and stops folding over. And then I usually push down and to the left. Once that happens, and then there's a part I talked about yesterday about like that little round over move at the very end. That's kind of like one of the most important parts to centering, is that last little bit there, right? So that's pretty close. It's not quite there. I usually, on a bigger, quote unquote, piece of clay, I will do that at least a couple times. You ever notice you're starting to get this like sort of volcano, like a divot that's going on here? One thing I usually do is I squish back down, because that will only exacerbate as you sort of cone. Make sure that this is very conical shaped, because if you start to cone and you have sort of a flat base or even like a divot, it'll just get worse and worse and worse. Another thing you can do is, as I'm coning, once I get towards the top, I round my thumb over like this, and that has a tendency to sort of get rid of that, that basin, as it were. And then oftentimes, just because slip is goopier than water is, right, I'll kind of collect the slip that I'm using and run it back down to clay. That way it's not going to waste. Down this way, switch hands, go down this way and round out. I don't have to make a super low center point. You can. It's not going to work against you if you do that, but you don't necessarily have to. It depends on what feels more comfortable to you. Right. Anybody have any questions so far? Centering is probably the thing that will hold you back the most when you're trying to do double the amount of clay that you usually do. So like, don't beat yourself up. Give yourself a break on the fact that it's going to be potentially twice as difficult as you're used to. So that feels close, it's still not quite there, so I'm going to do one more. And the more clay you use, the more times it takes me to get up to full height, so don't just like muscle trying to get it up in one. It's a funny thing I've noticed watching people throw too, and this is everybody, this is students, this is instructors, this is everybody. People either do this thing as they're going, which is like my favorite. I think it's so funny. Or they do the thing that I do where I look dead eye off to the side, where I'm just like, as I'm throwing, which I think is really funny. Very rarely do people look like really cool as they're focusing, you know what I mean? All right, so we're centered here. I'm going to establish my middle by taking my finger guns from the outside and sort of tracing inward. When I do that, that will give me a little mountain. If I push past that mountain, that will yield a divot. Where that divot is the very, very center of my clay. This will prevent you from guesstimating where the center is and just going down with your thumbs. Then I'm going to open up. You guys can see my wheel's going max speed. My feet are not on my wheel when I do this. I sort of set it and forget it, like that old chicken rotisserie infomercial.
Have you slowed it down yet? Or?
Nope. I go max speed until I start to pull. Just because then the wheel is sort of working in my favor instead of against me. But once I start to pull, it starts getting a little sketchy to go maximum speed. So Now I'm just sort of diving down. I'm using 2 hands just because, like, as I get above 3-4 pounds, me doing it with just like a couple fingers doesn't quite do it. So I kind of dive in with this like flying V shape, right? And then this hand sort of just backs that hand up. That feels pretty good. It's always a little difficult for me to gauge depth on something that's like this big when I center it. So while for smaller forms, I sort of just know where 1/4 inch is. For bigger forms, I do check. So like there, I actually went a little thinner than I would like. I'm not going to trim this, or I'm not going to do traditional trimming on this. So it doesn't matter to me that it's a little bit thin, but I don't want it to be so thin that it's going to cause me issues. All right, now we got to bring it out. When I do that, I have, especially on a big piece of clay, if you pull out at the wrong speed relative to what your wheel is spinning, it'll throw everything sort of into an oval shape. So what I do is this hand sort of backs it up here, my other hand wraps around, and while I'm pulling with this hand is almost pushing in to keep everything in shape.
You're not clawing it, you're just pulling it.
It's a little bit of both, honestly. There's like a little bit of claw, there's a little bit of pulling.
Can you recenter, if you get a little off center, you can recenter from that point?
A little bit, right? So I don't know if you guys can tell, but mine like has a little bit of a wiggle to it, right? I'm not super worried about it. I can always like lean in on it a bit. And oftentimes, if there's a little bit of a wiggle, the more you pull, that wiggle will turn from side to side wiggle into up and down undulation on the lip, which I can always cut off later. So now that we're to here, I'm going to compress the bottom. Don't forget this step, one of the most important. And then we're going to slow this down a little bit. Around there seems pretty good. Usually like the bigger a hunk of clay, kind of the slower I go. Just because like you go a little bit too fast, that whole thing can sort of go flying, right? So because we're making a cylindrical shape in a vase, I'm going to lean in on the clay and make this sort of volcano shape from the get-go. Because again, if I'm shooting for a cylinder, I want to be actively trying to throw this shape, right? So now that we're there, and much to the point I just made a second ago about like there's no right or wrong way. Some people do this first couple pulls with their knuckle, right? Some people do this first couple pulls with the heel of their hand. There's not a right way necessarily. There's just like ways that I find that like work for me and ways that don't. For me, the like muscle pulls, as I call them, like work the best if I pitch a sponge in between my fingers and use that as sort of a lubrication reservoir as I start to pull. I'm trying not to get greedy with these first couple. Just because there's so much clay, oftentimes you can make a thin spot, right? So I'm going to gradually make the base thinner and then the whole piece taller as I pull, right? Really what should be happening in your wall thickness is when you first start, like your bottom's really thick, top's kind of thin, right? And then as you throw, it should gradually get to where it's pretty even everywhere, okay? All right, so little by little, pushing out with my inside fingers, pushing in with my outside fingers. Really trying to focus on getting up and in. Again, I want to make that conical shape the whole time I'm throwing this because it's really easy to make things wide. It's much more difficult to make a wide thing skinny, right? So what I'm going to do too is like make little scissor hands here, drip some moisture on my knuckles so it goes down the inside of the wall and the outside of the wall. Make sure I'm fully lubricated everywhere. Try to avoid doing this and then throwing, which is a thing that I notice a lot of folks do. Like really make sure you're well lubricated everywhere. I'm going to force some clay, which I might lose some as I'm doing that, right? It's because I'm forcing that clay inward, but I'm going to go ahead and choke this in a little bit because I don't want a really wide vase. I want sort of a tall, narrow vase. So I'm going to do like a version of collaring where I kind of just push everything in. Every time you do that, you make everything thicker, right? So it's one thing to be mindful of.
Did you just do that at the very bottom?
Yeah, so I did it all the way down here. You know, usually you collar, you're just kind of collaring the top.
Yeah.
This is sort of the same thing, but I'm pushing everything in. Just because I realized this base is a little wider than I wanted it to be. Now it's just kind of a rinse and repeat. Throwing something a little bit taller is much easier to do on a sit-down wheel. I usually do it on a stand-up wheel because I think it's kind of fun to challenge myself in that regard. But after a certain point, when I'm like pulling up to here, it starts to be a little awkward, right? So I'll show you guys a trick for dealing with that. And then as soon as my fingers can touch, I have them touch. I'm also using much more pressure on the bottom, and as I rise up, I'm using less and less pressure. Anybody have any questions? And then I kind of just choke everything back in every once in a while, just to remind it that I want it to be a certain shape. And then we'll repeat. I keep using the sponge method on the bottom until I get a good chunk of that clay up. Like so, right? And again, the shape we're shooting for is we want that sort of conical shape all the way through, right? If I start using pressure on the bottom corner, sometimes the top starts to go a little wobbly on me, right? So one way I've found to avoid that is I totally switch the manner in which I'm throwing, where instead of throwing with my middle finger, I'm going to throw with my thumb, right? I do that by flipping my hand upside down. When I do that, my pinky can stabilize the piece as I'm rising up. What that looks like is this. And it's easy up until this point, and then it gets a little tricky, so you have to be a little more gentle up top here. But the point being, it's not like your thumb is the best tool for doing that. It's really just that your pinky is stretched up and can support the piece as you're going, right? I'm going to choke the bottom in a little bit more because it's still a little chunky for me.
So the shape you're going for is a cylinder?
Roughly cylinder. So like most things start as a cylinder and then I will add shape to it afterwards, right? But I make my cylinder kind of as tall as I can, and then I'll start to do some shaping. Because usually when you do shaping, you lose height.
Yeah.
So I basically want the tallest version of a thing I can make for now. I'm going to finagle my hand down there to get out some of that water so I don't have too much water sitting in the base, because that will weaken my wall. Also, because we're using little loafers, it doesn't have any grog in it, so it's going to be kind of difficult to get it. It throws really easy, but it's difficult to get tall because there's not sort of a little particulate and bisque and stuff like that in there to give it structure. So just one thing to be mindful of. All right. So now that I got rid of all the water, I'll add some more water. And then we'll repeat. And I just do this till I feel satisfied that I've gotten most of the clay out of the bottom corner. Which again, like no matter how long you've been throwing, the bottom corner is always going to be, for the most part, the heaviest part of your pot. I'm easing up on pressure as I get towards the top because the top's much thinner than the bottom is. I mean, and even being able to throw like a really tall cylinder is like something you guys should shoot for, you know what I mean? And again, like really tall can go in quotes, because to some people this is like the least amount of clay they throw with. I make usually pretty functional stuff that I want to be in that sellable price range, you know what I mean? So I'm not making gigantic vases all that much, but every once in a while it's fun to do. So now that we're here, we're roughly where I think we're going to get. I'm not getting too much more height on each concurrent pull, which is usually my way of knowing that, like, hey, my clay is saying I'm done. So now we're going to focus on shaping, and we're going to compress the walls. First thing, though, because I know I have extra clay, I always do, I'm going to come down from the side here. You know what, where's the camera? Right here? I might do this here so you guys can see. I'm going to come down from the side, and I'm going to carve in kind of straight down. I usually do this by holding onto the top too because I'm putting torque on the bottom. Sometimes I can throw the top off center. And I go down until I hear that sound that lets me know I've made it all the way to the bottom, right? And then I fill that moat I just made with water. Do that usually by pointing a stick at it. And then I'll run a needle tool underneath. And that'll just slide right off, right? Yeah, in the inevitability that it's like, it's always going to be tricky to get the clay out of here, you might as well just cut it off, you know what I mean? At a certain point. Sometimes if that does add a little bit of wobble, I'll just sort of do a collar all throughout to sort of even things out. Now at this point, if I go with my arm in there, the lip is going to rub on my hand, right? So what I want to do is grab some slip and like lubricate my whole arm here. That way, if it needs to, it can slide across, right? I'm doing that so that I can compress with a tool. compression will yield you a wall that can be thinner, but is still very strong. Like that. And then we're also like scraping goop off, right? Theoretically, like, you can be done. You know what I mean? Depending on what shape you're going for. I don't particularly love sort of like the traditional vase shapes that like go out and then have a big shoulder and then come in for a neck. Oftentimes I like either a very subtle curve or a very angular sort of design. So in my opinion, I'm pretty close to the shape that I want to have in general. So I might exaggerate some of this a little bit. It's a little dry on the inside. If you ever notice things are dry, don't be afraid to add moisture. Right? You just trying to wing it sometimes is difficult. The only caveat to that would be if you're in the middle of a pool and you notice that you're starting to dry out, you should never stop in the middle of a pool. You can, right? But like you shouldn't like rely on that. Oftentimes what I do, if I'm in the middle of a pool and notice anything gets dry, I make my surface area I'm using to pull smaller, right? The smaller the surface area, the drier you can work. That's why ribs work on a dry surface, because it's a teeny tiny surface area, right? So when I'm pulling, if I notice it starts to get dry, instead of using the pad of my fingers, I'll switch to the tip of my fingers, and then I can usually finish out the pull. Just like a little trick for you. Now let's go in here, exaggerate this just a little bit. I don't love a pot with a super big hip, so I'll try to skip the hip and go straight either to the belly or the shoulder. And I'm not super worried about what the bottom shape is, because when I said I'm not going to trim it, I mean I'm not going to flip it upside down. I am going to trim the bottom third of this while it's attached. And so what I'm basically imagining, right, and when I'm doing the shape is I want it to do this, and then I know it's going to be a little skinnier at the bottom, which is what I'm shooting for. So I might color this in just a smidge here and make that shape that I said I wasn't going to make. Do a little bit of pull. One of the reasons I like a standing wheel is I can get down on my knees and really see what's happening with the shape, which I find is a little bit more difficult to do on a sit-down wheel. What do we think about that? It's fine. It's not great. It's pretty traditional, right? I'll pull this up a little bit more. And this is usually the part of the process where I like fuss with it for like 20 minutes, deciding if I like it or hate it. You can do some shaping without an inside hand. You just have to be mindful of not adding too much pressure. I'm going to slow this down a little bit. What I'm going to try to do is fold the lid in. You don't have to do this. This is just me like being like, all right, how do we make this different? I'm going to do that by slowing the wheel down and just slowly kind of fold that over. You could probably do this easier if you cut it with a tool. It's interesting because I like the way this looks, but this makes a much less useful base because you can fit less stuff in it, you know what I mean? But it is a little bit more interesting, IMO. And what I try to do most of the time is throw my form 75% of the way there, and then I will trim the last 25% into it, right? So here I think I'm most of the way there. I got like a sort of weird lip going on because I wanted to do something different. Again, you don't have to. But I think I might call it here. And I'm not going to cut this off the wheel. Reason being, it's in the middle right now, right? If I leave it there until it gets leather hard, I can trim it just by putting the bat back on the wheel, right? And then I can trim the bottom third of it and then refine any of these shapes that I don't particularly like. That's one way I'm able to get my forms really angular, because you trying to throw really angular is difficult because angles are weak points when you're throwing, right? So what I do is I throw kind of a rounded angle, and then I'll trim a sharp angle into it so that I can get the actual sharp points that I want. Does that make sense? Cool. That's the demo. Progress of what I want you to do this week. Whatever you're going to usually throw with, double it, and then try to make something tall. And then next week what we'll do is either we'll do the ring molds, or we'll do the same concept of doubling the clay, but we'll make a big bowl. And then we'll use potentially like flocculated slip to decorate. Sound good? I know, lots of jargon thrown at you. Yeah, it'll make more sense next week. All right, go have fun.